Dr. Qanta Ahmed grew up in London, graduated from the University of Nottingham, practiced as a doctor in Saudi Arabia for a year. Dr. Ahmed described the BDS movement with which we are trying to struggle as an attempt to vilify Israel. In 2010, Dr. Qanta described herself as an accidental Zionist and that Eretz Israel is a vital shelter, an only shelter from lethal genocidal anti-Semitism. Dr. Qanta Ahmed is a senior fellow of the Independent Women Forum, and she is also an honorary fellow of the Technion, so it's a long friendship. And I should say that especially in these very tough times, your friendship is especially dear to us. As you know, I mean, you have traveled through the country in recent days. These are, I would say, some of our hardest moments in the Jewish history, I would say, in some sense parallel only to what happened during the Holocaust in the 1940s, in terms of cruelty, barbarism, and I would say that of course we are all, or I should say that the Hamas, the Islamic terror organizations, in their doings outcasted themselves from humanity. And so did also those who support that, and those who cannot really distinguish between the horrors that took place on October 7th and the ongoing conflict between the Arab-Israeli conflict. People should realize, and I'm sure that you will speak about it, that it was not just another round in that conflict. It was something else, which of course reminded us of the Holocaust. And I believe that any Jew, of course, but any member of humanity will record that, that event forever. So it's an historical event that we are experiencing right now. It has not ended yet. At the moment, there are over nearly 230 abducted Israelis in the Gaza Strip, including children. Youngest is 9-month baby in the Gaza Strip, elderly people. So this cruelty, this barbarism really has no parallel. And we're very grateful for your support. It is always dear to us, and especially during these times. So please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Sivan. Good morning, and thank you very much for having me. It was extremely important for me to come to Israel as soon as I began to understand what had transpired. Outside of my medical practice, I'm an academic sleep specialist at NYU. I'm not here in that capacity. I'm here just as a human being. Within about 48 hours of the news circulating in the US headlines, I began to receive messages denying the reality, suggesting there was some kind of contrived or artificial component, that it was not real, or it was self-inflicted, or other forms of denial. And those messages came to me from my own personal circle. At the same time, we began to see this very overt expression in protests around the world that claim to be pro-Palestinian, but I see as very dangerously legitimizing Hamas. Because of those two events, within days, I was able to come and witness for myself what has happened to Israel, to your fellow citizens, and I would classify it as a crime against humanity. I believe I've seen repeated evidence of a genocidal attack. It's very important that we no longer label October 7th as a massacre, but as a crime against humanity, and a crime against humanity that was perpetrated with very calculated, very strategic, lethal intent of extermination of a targeted group. I'm not an expert in the laws surrounding crimes against humanity, but I suspect I'm going to start reading about that a great deal. I wanted also to show that at least one Muslim who has combated radical Islam for almost 2 decades is here to bear witness to an atrocity that is purely Islamist in intent and very much mirrors other Islamist jihadist acts. I was a physician in Saudi Arabia on September 11th and saw the September 11th attacks live from Saudi Arabia. That was really my introduction to the concept of radical Islam. I was at the time in a very austere Saudi Arabia that no longer exists, that was governed by reactionary Puritan clerics of what outsiders refer to as Wahhabism. And even at that time, while I was devastated, New York has always been my American home, almost the entire 30 years of engagement with the US that I've had. Even at that time, physicians who were Muslims, as I'm a Muslim, physicians who were trained by New Yorkers, as I've been trained, expressed schadenfreude and a strange kind of satisfaction at 9/11 that I could not relate to, particularly as physicians where we spent months or years trying to fix an organ or a limb or get one human being off a mechanical ventilator. So this was the first tectonic shock. Over time, as I continued my practice, I also would take time, whenever invited, to see things for myself. So I've traveled to the Northwest Frontier area, the KPK province of Pakistan, to meet Pakistani civilians, Pakistani neuropsychologists who were de-radicalizing the Taliban that would abduct children and radicalize or seduce children and radicalize. And I spoke to those children in their native languages to understand how they entered jihadist terrorism and how Islamism cultivated generations of these children. So I've seen that in Muslim majority Pakistan. That's almost, I'd say, 12 years ago now. After that, I also visited post-ISIS Iraq at the invitation of Dr. Jan Kazilhan, one of the world's authorities on genocide and migration, to see the aftermath of the genocide of the Yazidis. Approximately 12,000 Yazidis were murdered in ISIS genocide in the region between Iraq and Syria in their ancestral homelands. And even today, 4,700 Yazidi, largely women and girls, remain disappeared, having been kidnapped, trafficked, or murdered. The community does not know. That's a very small community of essentially around, I think, 800,000 Yazidis originally. But because there is belief in endogamous marriage, many women and girls were murdered, that community's population is decreasing, and so the genocide in effect continues on the Yazidis. The world was in abject horror at the actions of ISIS. King Abdullah of Jordan himself, when witnessing a Jordanian Air Force pilot, Captain Muad, being immolated alive in a cage by ISIS, videoed and the images disseminated around the world, King Abdullah of Jordan got into his own helicopter and led sorties against ISIS. And in the background, I've been treating my patients in New York, a large component of whom are first responders to September 11th and continue to have September 11th related illnesses affecting their lungs, their sleep, other parts of their body. Those people that are suffering from those illnesses now exceed the numbers that were killed on September 11th, which is around just under 3,000 people. So many more have become sick and dying. So even if I wanted to escape this matter, as a physician and as a Muslim, I've had almost a 25-year panoramic view of the terror and havoc wrought by Islamist jihadism. What have I seen, and why would I call it a crime against humanity, and why I would encourage President Sivan and former President Peretz-Levy in their documents that they're about to send to the world's university presidents to use the language of genocide, to use the language of crime against humanity, is because the evidence is overwhelming. On my first night when I arrived here on October 20th, I was driven to the south of Israel to Moshav Te Ashur, and in the morning when it was daylight, I was taken by the IDF into Kibbutz Be'eri. And I was able to walk through the kibbutz and see anything that I wished to. I'm very sorry to report I walked into the homes where the atrocities had occurred, into the kitchens, into the safe rooms, into the living rooms where people had been recently murdered. And in fact, the remains of the atrocities, including congealed blood, including the murdered weapon, was still there. And I have filmed some of that. More importantly, even than that, was the evidence that these were Jewish homes. So as I just arrived a few minutes ago to Peritz's home, I noticed the menorah and the Hanukkah, which was in an elevated place in his in the entrance of his home. Similarly, I saw all of those symbols of religions, of the Jewish religion in these homes. People were murdered in their home completely unsuspecting. Because of my relationships here in Israel, I was also present in the screening of the IDF that showed us 43 minutes of live footage that Hamas had carefully assembled on body cams, the dash cams of victims, the CCTV, the traffic cameras. All of that was shown to me. And one of the things that defines a genocide, targeting of a specific group based on its identity, in this case, Jewish identity, Israeli identity. Most of those that are prosecuting Islamist genocide do not realize Israel is at least 20% non-Jewish. So they don't understand that, and they don't recognize that inside Israel we have excellent integration of Jews and Muslims. The Technion is the jewel in the crown of that in terms of multi-ethnic and multi-religious population that works together to solve complex problems. That's unknown to them. Therefore, I have also met Israeli Arab Bedouins who lost 4 children to Hamas rockets on October 7th. So this assault was on the Israeli people as symbols of the Jewish state, and it was specifically seeking out Jews going to kibbutz, which were largely inhabited by Jews, but non-Jews were also murdered. The other way we know this is a genocide is it was premeditated. There was nothing to suggest that this was a group of soldiers caught in the frenzy of battle and losing control of their violence. This was extremely systematic. Many eyewitnesses have told me that the commandos came with tablets which contained floor plans, which knew about the levels in the homes, even the names of the families. And I found this extraordinary as to why they would know the names of the families if the intent is to kill everybody. That was because certain communities, moshavs and kibbutzes that I visited where there were survivors explained that they were also home to people that had served as elite commanders previously in their military roles, and they may have been very valuable assets as hostages, or they may have been targets of vengeance for certain military operations. That can be the only explanation. The other feature that this was a genocide or crime against humanity is the extraordinary documentation of the atrocities. The IDF leaders, I think Admiral Hagari, told us they have in their possession terabytes of video data. Terabytes of data. We were shown 43 minutes. It's not necessarily chronological, it's like a montage, but that is a fraction of what the IDF was able to show us. The other intent of the genocide is to completely destroy the spirit and soul of a nation. And so to inflict even further pain, the theft of babies, the theft of old people, the theft of young people, the abduction, I'm talking about the taking of hostages, so that this pain continues to be exercised on the state of Israel in a way that's very different than artillery or suicide bombing. This is a very, very deep pain where every parent in the nation feels unable to protect their child, unable to protect their home, and it deepens a sense of powerlessness. So we cannot call October 7th a massacre. I don't think even calling it a terrorist attack is sufficient. We must begin labeling this a crime against humanity. And as a very influential university, I would urge you to engage all of your supporters to begin building a commission of legal scholars who can define that in the truly accurate manner, legally as a crime against humanity, and classify this as a genocide. If you remember genocides in Bosnia, many were not classified because evidence was not gathered. There's an extraordinary amount of evidence. After Kibbutz Be'eri, I was able to, as I was leaving Kibbutz Be'eri, I was able to see one gentleman come back to his home in Kibbutz Be'eri. He looked like he was gathering things. He explained to me it was the first time he'd been back since October 7th, and I was probably there on October 20th. And after a discussion, I was able to take some testimony from him, which is not for the public, but he described to me, he was probably in his late 40s, how he protected his wife and 2 children for about 12 to 14 hours with one weapon and a chair placed against the safe room, and stood there as a sentry in that terror, and how he saw the terrorists walking around with impunity, and we do see that on the footage. They have no fear. It's not like terrorists you see in a movie. They're walking around with ownership of the space, absolutely no fear. Many have wondered if they were on substances, if they were on Captagon or other stimulants. To me, they seemed extraordinarily lucid, but obviously I've only seen a fragment of the data. They seemed absolutely intentional. We also were able to hear audio tapes which have now been made public by the Israeli authorities of the celebration of the killing and the seeking the validation, including from the mother and father of the terrorists. You've all heard that call. So this was intentional, this was planned, this was very different than a suicide attack that might have happened in a mosque in Pakistan or in a bus in Israel. This is a different order of magnitude. While I was seeing this, I was in conversation with Professor Jan Kazilhan, who has been instrumental in getting classification for the Yazidi genocide as a genocide, and discussing some of what I'm seeing. We now look in retrospect to what ISIS was perpetrating on the Yazidis as maybe a preview, a horrendous initial glimpse of what has been engineered and what has been planned. And this is not about necessarily the scale, but the extent to which the barbarity has been perpetrated on the bodies that I've seen rivals and perhaps even exceeds what was performed on the Yazidi population. To look at those bodies, I visited Al-Shura, which is part of the Israeli Ministry of Defense in an area called Ramleh, I think, and that Al-Shura, or I don't know if it's Shura or Al-Shura. Shura, pardon me. Shura, I think, means line in Hebrew. So they formed a way of receiving the remains of people. And I saw all of that process until they also needed to go there because the normal places where the human remains go do not have the capacity. So they had to build, they have essentially a capacity of 200 bodies in their morgue. They brought 25 shipping containers. I walked in the containers. Each container contains 48 places for a person's remains. I counted 25 containers. There are still dozens, if not more, that are unidentified. And the last time I saw containers like that was in the pandemic when I talked to Peretz in New York about the genocidal scale of death in the pandemic in the first wave. But this, of course, is a real genocide. This is a criminally perpetrated genocide. In those places, I spoke to 2 sets of professionals. The Israeli police who perform basic detective work. Who was this person? What were the items on their person? What was the mode of death? What was the injuries? Was there a nearby weapon? Begin some DNA data gathering, begin looking at fingerprints and other samples that they take. Later on, they go to an area where crime scene investigators are also examining and photographing and documenting. Some people were identified only by the medical prosthesis in their body because there's a serial number on that, or a pacemaker. Some of the prostheses were so old, they were contacting manufacturers because the models are expired. So they're using every possible way of identifying. They also had to receive body bags and open body bags and see what was inside the body bag, just like you and I would not know. And they described to me what it was like to open a body bag. At the end of all of their investigations, they have a Siemens CT scanner. This entire facility was built in the night of October 7th. It's remarkable that by October 8th, they began to receive bodies, or October 9th. So overnight, they built this facility. And one Israeli police worker explained to me how it was necessary to open body bags, and sometimes the only item was a decapitated human head. And to place that with dignity on a CT scanner, he talked to me about that. One crime scene investigator spoke to me about receiving the charred remains of human beings, of which there are tragically many remains. And in fact, the CT scanning imaging was profoundly valuable, because you've seen some of those images. And also I also visited with Dr. Hen Kugel, the director of the National Forensic Science, but the CT scan revealed the atrocity that was present in incinerated remains. Even in the face of this crime against humanity, the incredible humanity and compassion of the response of the Israeli professionals and volunteers that are working with this is staggering. One such investigator explained to me that he had identified charred remains of a child and knew who this person was and informed the family, and the mother was present and was begging to see the remains. And the crime scene investigator, the Israeli police officer, begged the mother to not look at the remains. And the mother was insisting, and so this person described to me, he fell to his knees and kissed the legs of the mother to beg her, please do not make me show you what remains. And the mother insisted, and then he had to witness how the mother completely collapsed in horror, and he knew that she would be changed for life. So they are talking about these experiences to me days after they've had them, and they are grief-stricken. Several of the professionals working at the Shura explained to me how since they've begun working, they're unable to hold their own children. They can't touch their toddlers. They can play with their children and talk to their children, but they're unable to hold them. There is also the IDF rabbinical unit that is then handling the remains additionally in other capacities, and perhaps in religious capacities. They did not allow me to look at remains because they explained in Jewish tradition this is not possible. And one of them explained to me how he would go home and open his refrigerator and smell death. I was unable to. He closed the refrigerator, the smell went away. Opened the refrigerator, he could smell the smells of the Shura. The impact on these human beings is unfathomable, and I think it will become apparent in many months. They described in tremendous detail the devastation prosecuted on the bodies of these innocent people. A day or two later, I visited Abu Kabir. I said it was very important for me to witness, because I'm a physician, I've been to morgues and autopsies before, and so I wanted to see this, and Dr. Hen Kugel gave me open access, encouraged me to go to the forensic laboratories that were downstairs from his office, and I began first by meeting a group of people that were studying with intense focus what looked like a set of teeth, except they were a color gray, and anyone who wants to see and learn all of these things are on my social media, and if you don't want to see, there's no need to see it. And they were aligned by shape. There were probably 5 or 6 professionals led by a professor. Her first name was Michal. Her PhD was in the incineration of teeth. I don't know the exact name of her thesis, but that was her expertise. And they explained that many of the remains they're receiving have been incinerated at temperatures above 700 Celsius, which destroys all organic DNA matter. And therefore, we were looking at hydroxyapatite or calcium phosphate. There was nothing else left. Therefore, they would then correlate where this remnants, this dentition had been found with a map. They had a map of the IDF base. The map was like a pencil architectural drawing. Whoever had gathered the remains had marked the place on the map, and they were therefore deducing who this might be. And it was very heartening and humbling to see 5 or 6 highly educated professionals laboring over what is a handful of remnants of a human being for hours to try and provide some solace to the grieving families who may still not know that this person has passed away. In the next room, I met several other professors, one of whom was retired and is an acclaimed forensic pathologist. And he was studying 2 vertebral bones, and I recognized the shape. And the vertebral bone that he was looking at, he explained to me, it looked like the vertebral bone in a spinal column, which, if all of you know, is in a series, very characteristic. They get bigger lower down in the spine and smaller higher up. But it had a completely intact lip on the bone. So it wasn't just a flat bone, there was a nice lip with no interruptions. And he explained that that contour on the bone means it's between the age of 16 and the age of 40. At 40, we begin to develop osteophytes and disfigurement of that lip, and below 16, the lip is not yet fully in union. And so this correlated also with the IDF base, which had been destroyed in the initial assault and likely was a part of a spinal column of an IDF soldier who was murdered by the Hamas and subject to these tremendous fires. The temperature of over 700 Celsius, Dr. Kugel explained, indicates that accelerants were used in the fire. It was not only potentially a grenade, but there was also most likely kerosene and other things. All of this points to systematic, organized, premeditated, fully planned genocide. This was not about struggling for any political outcome. This is true genocide that we're seeing. Many of the injuries that we've heard about in the international press, including to pregnant women, including injuries even to intrauterine fetus that was, murdered in a grotesque way. When I was speaking to my colleagues at the Shoah Foundation, where I'm on a committee combating contemporary anti-Semitism, they said these are exactly the injuries that were documented in the Rwandan genocide. So if there's nothing you remember from my visit here, it's just I want to tell you what you're experiencing is you're witnessing a genocide, and there is a responsibility Israel has to document that genocide and label it crime against humanity, irrespective of the response of the international community. I think that is the #1 responsibility that all of us here and all of you here share. It's very heavy material to talk about. I'm so sorry for this. So it weighs heavily. As I was speaking to people, many times, because I'm not coming with a notepad and a camera, this was one of the first opportunities professionals had to speak to me about themselves. And they began to realize their own sorrow and their own loss and their own fear, and this feeling the nation is feeling that the nation is orphaned. And I'm not in a position to discuss Israeli politics, I'm not educated on it, but there's a really deep feeling in the nation, irrespective if someone is a centrist or a left or right-leaning, of being bereft and orphaned. And so that's a feeling that's very, very shared. But if there is anything more barbaric than what I have witnessed, and there's other barbarity I saw, before I forget, I will mention that many of the corpses or the unidentified remains or the cadavers, I don't know the best word to use, of the murdered people, many of them you've heard about were restrained with zip ties that the terrorists brought. And so the bodies have the zip ties. They've been cut because the pathologist or the police worker cut them to store the body in a slightly better position. But some of those hands were restrained by electrical cords taken from presumably domestic appliances. So this was utterly barbaric. If there were not enough zip ties, then electrical cord was used, and people arrive in body bags tied by electrical cord, and I have made documentation of that as well, and that is being documented at the National Institute of Forensic Science. So if there was anything that could be more barbaric than what I'm describing or what was perpetrated on the bodies of individuals, many of the bodies of the individuals showed multiple modes of death. It was not sufficient just to shoot them. It was a kind of hatred that repeatedly assaulted and devastated that body. More barbaric than that is the denial of the event. And as time has gone by, this denial, I've read a great deal about Holocaust denial. I've seen movies and read books about it, but I now understand how wounding the denial is. And it's almost as if the more evidence and the more data that begins to appear, the more intense the denial is. And the response of, let's say, American academia, of which I'm part, has been utterly astounding. All of what I'm witnessing is not to deny that there is hardship on Palestinian people who, in my opinion, are under occupation of Islamism and are subject to Hamas governance. So I'm not going to talk about borders and land. This barbarity of denying from our own colleagues, and it happens all day long. I see what's put on my social media, my Twitter. I don't know what reception I'm going to receive when I get back to New York. Though fortunately, as a faculty member of NYU, I've been on a phone call with our chairman of the board, Ken Langone. I was part of a few hundred doctors listening to him. And also Dean Grossman, the medical school dean. They are extremely committed to standing with Israel and ready to provide a humanitarian response. I don't speak for them, but they did convey that to us, and that is not a silent that's been documented in the letter. But the vast majority of American academia seems to report some need to make moral equivalence, some need to even try and comprehend Hamas, some need to condemn Israel. And I want you to understand, irrespective of how you feel of the politics, Israel is not fighting a conventional conflict with Hamas about dismantling rocket attacks or arguing over territory or border or access to resources. This is a battle that the United States has prosecuted for 25 years since 9/11. It is the same battle that a multinational coalition waged against ISIS. ISIS, I think, was destroyed. It was not defeated. There's a big difference. Destroy means dismantle. Defeat means you can never be reconstituted. And so this war is of completely different proportions. And what staggered me is why the same academia, the same educated, wealthy communities that felt horrified at ISIS, would never contemplate of raising the flag of ISIS, are now providing surrogate legitimacy to Hamas in a way that's extraordinary. It's not only American academia, and I really want to know how I can be part of an academic response to counter that. One thing NYU did is when individuals were putting pictures of the kidnapped and the missing and other people were taking them down, NYU and the Tisch family, I think, arranged for the images of the kidnapped and missing hostages to be projected on NYU library buildings. So there are responses to this. But it's also the international community. It's also Muslim majority leaders whom I greatly encourage to come and stand in the same places that I've stood, walk in the same autopsy places, see the movie that I saw of the 43 minutes of atrocities that Peretz hopes university presidents will see, I hope Muslim leaders will see. But the only difference I can see between the world's reaction to ISIS against the Yazidis, a genocide which also claimed the lives of non-Yazidi Kurds, also targeted Christians, if you remember, is that the target here is Jewish. And this to me means there is now open anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism has many forms, and anti-Semitism unfortunately has been incubating in American universities for decades. And most of the anti-Semitism people think about in the United States, let's say, might be right-wing or neo-Nazi anti-Semitism is often discussed. I've spent about 15 years understanding Islamist anti-Semitism, and I'll just say a couple of words about that. Islamist anti-Semitism looks at a central tenet, a core belief, is lethal, enmity with global Jewry, Judaism, Israel, anything that has any relationship with the Jew. There is a lethal enmity. That enmity is not mortal. It's not a conflict. It's not a war. It is a cosmic enmity. It has been religionized by a political totalitarian ideology with roots in Marxism. Islamism has taken that as a cover, almost, that this is a religious duty, that there is some kind of honorable afterlife if you prosecute this lethal enmity. That is one of the central philosophies of Islamism. If anybody wants to read about Islamism, the best author I've discovered in English is Bassam Tibi, who's written for 40 years on this subject. Some of his work is translated into English. Most of his work is in German. So you can read tomes written by Muslim scholars about Islamism. There is a reason why Egypt has outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood. There is a reason why Mohammed Morsi was ousted by 93 million Egyptians. Muslims do not tolerate Islamism to govern over themselves. This time last year, I was being honored in Saudi Arabia by Dr. Muhammad Al-Isa, the Secretary General of the Muslim World League, because of everything that I've said condemning radical Islam. We talked an enormous amount about anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Semitism and woke ideology, which I'll speak about. The Saudis have expunged Islamist ideology from their textbooks, their schools. Dr. Muhammad Al-Isa, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, King Abdullah, even King Fahd were gradually diluting reactionary clerics with more pluralistic clerics, so that Dr. Muhammad Al-Isa has hosted Jewish rabbis. They've had a minyan in Riyadh, and you saw this attack happening days after the Crown Prince himself confirmed to Fox News that there was every day a step closer to rapprochement with Israel. So as Muslims, we reject Islamism, even as there seems to be a Muslim support for incubating and empowering Hamas. That could be considered Qatar, that could be considered Iran, that could be considered Turkey, and that could be considered the outpouring of Muslim sympathy for Hamas in the face of the scenes in Gaza. Some of the most thoughtful relationships I have with Muslims who are really dear friends have been outraged at my documentation of what I'm seeing, including family members. But I'm not speaking of the crime against humanity that is occurring in Gaza. This is something that I get every day, and I'm probably going to have to answer for it in my family homes. There is no equivalence. There is no equivalence. If there is a genocide occurring in Gaza, that is the intention of Hamas that is willing to sacrifice its own population, its own fellow Muslim population, in service of its political aims. Some of my close friends in Israel go and do a 12-hour duty at night for the IDF in Arabic, calling the families in North Gaza to move south. The humanitarian corridor that was opened by Israel and Egypt to allow some supplies. There can be no basis for Israel to continue to provide fuel and energy and electricity for an Islamist jihadist group that is already apparently with 4 months of fuel supply in Gaza at the moment. We know that Hamas also uses medical infrastructure to shield its headquarters of operations. And so Hamas has calculated, war-gamed, the international response to Israel, and the academic response is playing into that role. How did American academia or British academia become so enmeshed so that they see Hamas as liberators, or they see them as heroes, or they see them as victims? They didn't make that calculation for ISIS. There is no difference in the ideology. In fact, Hamas is more malignant and better financed than ISIS ever was. That's where left-wing anti-Semitism comes into the fore. And I refer to it as woke neo-orthodoxy. There's probably better ways to describe it. But in the United States, we're seeing for about 15 years the adoption of something called critical race theory. I was completely unaware of it until the pandemic, when all of the country stayed home and the children were on Zoom doing their classes, and parents began to notice what was going on. And critical race theory really classifies everybody as either victim or oppressor. There's no other standard, and they use this classification on children in America. So little children come home and have to write an essay on why they regret being a white oppressor when they are 6 or 7 or 10 years old. It's an absolute distortion of history. It's absolutely dehumanizing of the American people. And the victim is everyone except those who are descendants of the greatest crime against humanity, the Jewish people. In this construct of critical race theory, the Jewish person has been inverted into the Nazi. Israel has been inverted into a colonial occupier state. While that might sound like something in a graduate class, it has become extremely ripe breeding ground for a marriage with Islamism, which also has lethal anti-Semitism. And so now you see terrible scenes in people that are in the line of fire in Gaza. This fits the victim narrative. There has been almost no mention of the atrocities that have happened in Israel in the language of crime against humanity that I'm describing to you. Think of Rwanda and how that was reported for those of us old enough to remember Rwanda. Think of Bosnia. Both genocides were allowed to go on too long before the world intervened, but there was no dilemma about the language. Instead, what I'm seeing in the news media and in the popular culture is a total erasure of the October 7th events. And erasing the Jewish identity is also part of this critical race theory, woke neo-orthodoxy. And there's certainly one document that I can share that's very detailed with permission that will describe this structure. That woke culture of victimhood being prized above all else except for the Jewish person has penetrated so deeply in the United States. It's adopted by Hollywood, it's adopted by media, it's adopted by corporations. Where is Nike and Coca-Cola standing with the families of the victims that I've seen their bodies? Where they stood with groups like Black Lives Matter, they stood with things to do with George Floyd, they stood with, who knows, vaccination, get your COVID shots, but they cannot stand with this. And that tells you that this ideology is extremely deep. We're now finally seeing, I heard yesterday from my friends that one of the very progressive hedge fund billionaires is withdrawing money from a university, even though these ultra-progressive, wealthy, influential minds have fueled woke orthodoxy. So we have to recognize left-wing anti-Semitism, ultra-progressive anti-Semitism is very empowered by woke ideology. And that is a perfect marriage with the Islamist anti-Semitism of the jihadist groups.
We saw massive protests in New York, LA, other places. London and France were also seeing. The United States, I believe the Muslim population is around 3 or 4 million, about 1% of the US population may be Muslim, I could be wrong. In Britain, it's about 5%. In France, it's about 6.5%.
We are now in a world where people consume the news they want. They consume the fake news they want. We are in an era of deep fakes. We're in an era of misinformation with the rise of digital internet and all this technology that allows us to get information immediately. We're also in the age of ignorance. There's a rise of ignorance. There's an amazing book that you might want to read about by Richard Proctor, who actually documented the history of big tobacco. And he is a professor of history at Stanford, but an honorary professor of pulmonary medicine. And he's written a book on agnotology, the culture and manufacture of ignorance. If you think about big tobacco, when it first came out, it was the most wonderful thing since sliced bread. And everybody was going to be healthy and happy, and even doctors were smoking tobacco. And then when people became sick, they funded research and said, look, we're doing research. And then when the mice developed cancers, they said, well, it has mouse carcinogens. There is a deliberate strategy to manufacture ignorance, and sometimes it's important. Sometimes it's a matter of national security that states do this. But we're in an era where ignorance travels greater distances than fact. And the only way to fight this is by repeating the truth and by inundating influences about the truth. What I think the United States and Europe doesn't realize is the atrocities that occurred in Kibbutz Be'eri and other places can easily occur anywhere else. I feel very concerned about the vulnerability of my Jewish colleagues. They have been attenuating their personal demonstrations of whatever their clothing and their religious head coverings already in New York, where we have the largest population of Jewish people outside of Israel. So this is a real dilemma for university leaders and for academia. And I think there's another factor at play, which is that university leaders are themselves cowed and intimidated by the very emboldened woke ideology. Because speaking up for the Jewish person, speaking up for the follower of Judaism is not seen as celebrating or embracing inclusion. I know we have leaders here of diversity and inclusion. That diversity, equity, and inclusion has never incorporated the Jewish voice, as far as I can see in my role as a physician in a university. I'm not involved in these committees, but somehow it always excludes the Jewish voice. And this brings me maybe to one of my final ideas, and then I'd be happy to answer questions, which is that there has been the concept of intersectionality. I'm not deeply familiar with that. For instance, I'm a Muslim, I'm a woman, I was a migrant, I'm a naturalized American. Everybody has multiple identities. In this concept of intersectionality and pursuit for diversity, equity, and inclusion, added to critical race theory, victim and oppressor, there is a tremendous Holocaust envy, a grotesque thing for me to say. And so I think it is not accidental that the scenes in Gaza are being described as a crime against humanity. The scenes in Gaza are being described as a genocide that Israel is perpetrating. I've seen that on social media. I don't know if it's in the news. And that is to acquire the world's guilt and compassion over a scene that is devastating. There are innocent lives being lost. I've dedicated my life to preserving life. I don't want harm to come to innocent families. But this is not a genocide that's being prosecuted by Israel. There is rightful, legal, and lawful response to prevent further genocide. That is well encapsulated in the laws surrounding military conflict. To not respond would mean to invite further expanded genocide, so the Israeli state has no choice. And also, if the Israeli state does not succeed at defanging and really bringing to ashes Hamas, this ideology is ripe to spread in other regions. Though I've had tremendous joy looking at the progress in Saudi Arabia, and most of the population in Saudi Arabia now, 70% has an average age of under 30. The mean age is 28. They're very interested in advancing their society. They see this society as collaborators, partners, science, technology, agriculture, industry, all of these trades, very, very natural fit. There is always the possibility that there is still some fundamentalist reactionary sympathies, and the scenes in Gaza are deliberately framed and deliberately projected and deliberately shared with the intention of inciting that sentiment. Remember the first Friday, Hamas declared a global day of jihad, and then I think a second Friday, Iran also declared a global day of jihad. On those days, I hadn't even arrived there. A person was stabbed almost fatally outside the Israeli embassy in Beijing. That is the intention. We've already seen 2 teachers, I think, killed in France by Islamist Technion jihadists in Paris. We've seen the head of a president of a synagogue in Detroit, who in fact was leading a Muslim-Jewish society, stabbed to death outside of her home, and the US authorities were afraid to call this a hate crime. So radical, woke, neo-orthodoxy is silencing many decent voices. If I think about my initial journey to this, and I have also visited Krakow and I visited Auschwitz, it was when I was asked to read the book Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Goldhagen by my own psychotherapist so I could understand the complexity around what was then the war between Hezbollah and Israel in, I think, 2006. And there I learned about the role of the bystander. Without willing executioners and with silent bystanders, the crime against humanity of the Holocaust was unstoppable for years. And that's why I think all of us have a responsibility, first to bear witness to what has happened to all of you. And if we're scientists and physicians and we have the ability to see things that the lay public can't see, that should be seen, because I think bearing witness is the first responsibility of humanity. I think the second responsibility, perhaps even more pressing than igniting the relationships in university leaders, is the need to have legal scholars here to quickly classify this as a crime against humanity and as a genocide. That should be done independently of any political conflict or any military conflict that's going on. And as I understand it, there's only a certain amount of time that you can get evidence that will still be valid and nothing will be rebuilt over the places. I think that's very, very essential. And I think the third thing is to expose the damage and destruction that's being achieved at the service of woke neo-orthodoxy. That doesn't mean that I don't believe in inclusion and diversity. My whole life has been pluralistic. I think a place like the Technion is now under pressure because of this conflict, the emotions, the fake news, the social media, maybe the sentiments, the pain. But a place like this can also rise out of that and become even more strongly knitted together. So I think those are the thoughts that were in my brain to speak to you, but I'm happy to talk some more, and thank you very much for allowing me to bear witness to what's happened here.